Julian, great talking to you. Thanks for joining me.
Very nice to see you, Timur. Thanks for having me.
Let's begin by describing what is Vision 2050.
So, Vision 2050 Time to Transform, as this update has been titled, is a comprehensive framework to guide business action that's in line with the urgency of the major challenges that we face, such as climate change, nature loss, mounting inequality.
I'd like to consider this, if I could, in two broad buckets, two broad themes. Firstly, the substantive content of the report. And secondly, I want to look at something, maybe we can headline it rather broadly as why. Why is the global business community, as represented by your membership, presenting reports like this under the rather startling rubric, if you ask me, of reinventing capitalism? We'll get onto that bit in a second. Let's first get into the substantive elements of the report itself. Now, what you've done is you've updated a report that came out 10 years ago, if I'm right, yes?
Yeah, correct, exactly. The original Vision 2050 came out in 2010.
And the reason you're doing it, as is clearly admitted to in the materials alongside your report, is that the first one said business as usual is no longer an option. That was kind of the mantra of the first report. And obviously here we are 10 years later, and business as usual is very much business as usual. So I guess you went back to say, right, what went wrong?
Sort of. I might create some aspects of that. I mean, I think firstly, it's important to point out, and actually the team behind the update were at pains to do this as often as possible. The original piece of work is actually still astonishingly relevant. The first thing we had to do when we started the refresh was to go back to the original report and read it through cover to cover again, which some of us hadn't done for a while. And actually, there's stuff in there that's still completely valid today. There are things in there that, as a community, as an industry, if you will, the sustainability industry, we've perhaps forgotten about, or things have fallen by the wayside that are nonetheless still very important today. So the main thing to say is that the original piece of work was groundbreaking then, and it remains relevant today. And I can only hope that ours is as accurate and as on point in 10 years' time as the original was.
Certainly, even then, it was a bit of a surprise that the tone that you were taking. But I mean, let's talk about the bits that you decided did need changing.
The main thing and the main reason that we went back to Vision 2050 was clearly, the numbers are not pointing in the right direction. Whatever change we had said needed to happen, even though we could point to progress in a number of different areas, certainly the progress that was occurring wasn't happening at the rate or scale required. And effectively, you had a piece of work from 10 years ago that said, we have to act now. We have just about enough time to get this all done. You're in a situation 10 years later where you have just as much, if not more, to get done and 10 years less to do it. So I think the real reason for going back to it was just to say, okay, we have this piece of work around which we can reinvigorate the urgency for these required to address these challenges. Why don't we go back to it and see how we can update it in such a way to do that? And at the end of the day, the starting point for our work was to say, okay, why hasn't change occurred quickly enough?
And the starting point for this revision.
For this revision, exactly.
Okay.
And actually, the original piece of work. So one of the reasons it was groundbreaking, as you say, is that it said business as usual was no longer an option, which was quite a bold statement for 2010.
For such august global companies, yeah.
Well, exactly for companies who at the time were even more incumbent than perhaps the incumbents we work with now, and secondly, it did this very interesting thing about splitting up the timeframes for change, and it divided the period of transformation into a period between 2010 and 2020, which they call the turbulent teens, where there would be volatility as we tried to figure out how to address these major challenges and how to start making progress at the scale that they were describing. And then we would sort of figure it out and things would settle down. And from about now onwards to 2050, we'd be in this renaissance of transformation, where everything would just start unfolding after the turbulence of the teens.
Oh, happy vision.
Exactly. It was a very, very happy vision. And so, of course, sitting there in 2019, when we first discussed how we would do it, prior to one of the biggest disruptions of the last 50 years, probably, we, one of the things that we were really focusing on was like, well, we're not at transformation time yet. Things still feel awfully turbulent. What is it that we're missing here?
And well, hold on a sec, because you made an interesting distinction a moment ago that kind of splits the conversation into two parts. If we could address that, you said we asked ourselves why. So there are those are the 2 points on there. Why did the last one not materialize as you thought, and what have you done to update that? So let's begin with that why. Have you come to a conclusion as to what went wrong?
So yes, in short. And there's actually a section in the report that talks about what the major barriers to transformation over the last 10 years were. But I think ultimately it's just the passage of time. When people talk about sustainability, the people talk about oil tankers and how they're enormous vessels that take a long time to turn around. And I feel society is effectively the largest oil tanker of all. It takes a huge amount of prolonged, sustained, and dedicated effort to make any change take place in society. And
right. Look, I mean, I take your point. I don't think there is a single corporation, institution, establishment that has gone into a process of major change and come out of it saying, that was easier than I expected. Change is always much harder than you anticipate. But you're putting the focus here on society. What about the report, and what about your membership? What about business in general? Surely they also played a role in not making the changes that were necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I, just to be clear, when I'm talking about society, I mean all of its major institutions, government, business, individual citizens. I have a knee-jerk reaction to blaming the individual or the citizenry for the lack of change. I always feel that like the big institutions of business and government should shoulder most of the responsibility. And so in terms of what we got wrong within the report, to answer your question, I don't think we got anything wrong. I think we were overly optimistic about the rate at which change could occur. A very traditional mentality within the sustainability industry is to work through a problem, find the answer and say, okay, all we need to do is get people to understand that that's the answer, and then they will do it. And we fail to take into account all the other things that pressure people, institutions, governments, businesses, whatever, to act in the way that they do. So at the time, it was actually written around about 2008. That was at the end of an incredibly successful run of economic growth, just before the crash set in. The financial crisis of 2008-9 was actually going on while they were completing it, but the mentality of business at the time was still optimistic. If we know what the plan is, we will go and do it. It will be okay. So I think we were too optimistic about the rate at which change would occur and the things that would get in the way of that change within the report. And if you want to ask why change didn't occur within business, within government, at the rate at which it should, I think it goes back to the answer I started with. It just takes an enormous amount of effort to turn the boat.
So having said that then, you looked at the report, you discovered a gap between expectation and reality. So what changes in the update? What have you done in order to redress that? What new things have you brought in to the review version?
Whilst going back to my original statement of how good the original was, we've basically started again. Its soul remains in there, but we started with a blank sheet of paper. And so the first thing we did was we looked at how systems transform. The original talks a lot about systems transformation, It identifies that will be the key to unlocking change at the rate and scale required, but it doesn't really go into very much detail on how systems could actually transform. Over the 10 years that passed, systems transformation became one of sustainability's buzzwords. And it was one of those things when we started looking into it that everyone was talking about and no one really knew what it was, or let alone how to do it. So the first thing we did was, okay, let's just go to the academic literature, to the business literature, and let's have a look into how systems transform and come up with a relatively simple map for how systems transformation happens that we can use to define what we look at in this update to Vision 2050. So that was our starting point. And once we had that map, we could then actually plot out the different ways in which business needed to act in order to bring about the transformations that were required. So the report's essentially split into 4 major sections, all of which are quite significantly changed from the original. The one that's least changed is the vision. The vision itself has remained the same. We've just added a little plus because population will definitely exceed 9 billion people. So our vision remains 9+ billion people living well within planetary boundaries. In the first section on that vision, 10 years on, the science has got a lot more mature. The thinking around what it means to live well is a lot more established. So we've provided business with practical definitions of what it means to live well within planetary boundaries so that we actually know what it is that we're aiming for. And then the work, the updates have become more significant. So the original had 9 pathways, but they were very much defined by the industry sectors that were involved in the original piece of work, as well as some of the major challenges at the time. And we've slightly thrown that on its head. We've reversed the way that we looked at what the pathways should be, and we actually said, okay, what are the essential things that society requires? What does society need from business rather than what sectors does business operate in? So we've reversed it and made the way we look at all these different challenges more people-centric. We said, okay, society needs energy, it needs living spaces, it needs a built environment, it needs water and sanitation, it needs food. And so our new 9 pathways are based on those things that society requires and that business therefore exists to provide.
Let me just ask you about the pathway as an idea, as a metaphor, if you like. What exactly does that consist of? I mean, we had recently the International Energy Agency came out with its interim report in which it described the pathway by which we need to get to the goals of the Paris Agreement. And everyone was very praiseworthy about the fact that they had actually described in some detail the technicalities of how to follow that pathway. Does your report provide business with a true roadmap and a true set of instructions which they can follow, or is it just a set of ideals and targets?
So I would argue that it provides some fairly comprehensive guidance on what business needs to do. That guidance is split into different sections, which I can continue to talk about in a second, but the pathways themselves are really there to offer business 3 things. 1, a very clear picture of what we are aiming for in that particular area, be it health and well-being, or products and materials, or transportation mobility. What is it that the world, a sustainable world in 2050 looks like when it comes down to that thing within society? We then describe in each of the pathways what the major transitions are that will bring about that vision. So in each case, we provide a comprehensive picture of the full spectrum of change that needs to take place. And then we provide a set of 10 prioritized action areas that are relevant for the next decade, that are not comprehensive, but that provide business with an absolutely clear set of to-do lists of things that will contribute to those transitions that are required. And we do that for each of the 9 pathways.
give me a couple of examples of what we mean then by pathways. Show me how this works in action.
Yeah, so I'll actually just bring it up here so I don't fluff my words. But so let's take energy, which everyone understands. We've got a vision for energy, which ultimately says we can power a net zero world. And our 2050 vision is a sustainable energy system providing reliable and affordable net zero carbon energy for all. So that vision is split up into 4 sort of subvisions to really paint the picture of the world we're trying to reach. Then within that vision, we have 7 key transitions that are essential if that's going to be achieved. So those are things like zero carbon electricity generation technologies are further innovated and adopted globally at speed. Or another one would be net zero carbon energy becomes affordable, reliable, and resilient. And so there are 7 of those transitions, which we then also tie directly to the achievement of the SDGs, so that we keep the SDGs as a central focal point within the pathway towards our vision. And then the action areas are then very specific things that companies can focus on over the next 10 years. So for instance, construct no new coal power plants, plan and implement a phase out of all unabated coal power generation by 2040, and reduce the share of coal in total global electricity generation to less than 10% by 2030. Some of these relate to companies alone, some relate to company collaborations with government stakeholders, for instance. Another one might be collaborate with peers, cities, and governments around the globe to align on common net zero carbon ambitions, set science-based targets, and drive implementation accordingly. So we're not guiding companies at a level of detail that's prescriptive to the extreme, but we are painting a fairly tight picture of the kinds of actions that just have to be driven forward over the next 10 years if we're going to start making the kinds of changes that are required.
Right. Let me ask a couple of questions about things that stood out in my mind from the report. One is the idea of true value. I mean, that was something that you had in the first report as well, and the suggestion of what value really represents in business terms and in societal terms. Explain what is true value in the context of this report, and then I'll follow up.
So true value is a concept that was actually in the original 2050. It was true cost, true profit, true value, I think was how they described it originally. But all it really means is that we incorporate the full range of capitals, as they're sometimes called, into how we measure value. So we accept that there are both positive and negative social impacts. There are effectively costs and profits that arise out of any activity. Similarly, there are environmental, ecological, or natural costs or inputs that we draw on in order to create profit in our world. And so those need to be factored into our decision making so that we really know whether something is truly generating value or whether it's actually just deferring costs.
Which is an interesting concept, and it brings me on to that. I guess the why section of the conversation that I wanted to have, by which I mean, why is the world of business looking at itself so deeply in this way? Because to a lot of people that would seem to be counterintuitive, and to a lot of people they'll maybe glance at things like this and raise an eyebrow and wonder what the real motive is. And I'm not saying that there is nefarious intent here, but I do want to explore some of the motivations and some of the perceptions that surround this. Because one of the things that I think is fairly clear over the past 10 years in which business as usual has persisted is the fact that business itself still does not recognize or want to acknowledge this notion of true value. Business itself still wants to work on the precepts of quarterly reporting, bottom line numbers. Value comes not from social capital or natural capital. So it's very all well and good to be talking about this stuff in this language, but what is the process by which business will actually be moved to act upon it?
So one of the questions that's regularly asked about this report is, why are a group of companies who have done and are doing very well from the current system coming together to say that system needs significant change needs to be transformed.
And it's more than that, isn't it? I mean, one of the intriguing things is that you're not talking simply about changing the system of business. You're actually, and quite explicitly, saying we need to reinvent capitalism.
Yeah.
Which to a lot of the people sitting in Washington, D.C. will sound like heresy.
That's absolutely fair. But I think it's important to make a split here between companies benefiting from the system as it currently is, and quite openly acknowledging the benefit from the current system, while simultaneously understanding that the equilibrium that system has existed within is beginning to break down, and therefore these questions need to be asked. The companies who we've worked with on updating Vision 2050, the companies who are members of WBCSD, they realize that the world is changing and that these pressures are building on a number of different levels. So one of the lines we use within the report is that the ultimate thing that we're driving for is thriving communities to trade with, and a healthy planet for us all to exist on. And companies have known for some time that those are essential core foundations to business success. But on a daily basis, they're seeing how those thriving communities, or that healthy planet for us all to exist on, are under ever greater threat. And so actually, the central message of Vision 2050 is not that this is some sort of do-good piece of guidance for sustainability, but actually that this is absolutely central to long-term business success, and that if you want to run your company well into the future, then you have to start taking into account the true value of things. You have to factor that into the way that you're making decisions. You need to think about your long-term resilience as a business. You need to think about the inputs that your business relies on for its long-term resilience and therefore its long-term success. And that means, again, coming back to this idea of true value, of making sure that where inputs from the natural world are used, you're using them in such a way that you can regenerate them, or that you can at least make sure that your footprint is as light as possible to do the thing that you need to do, so that you can continue to do it into the future, and allow the communities that you exist within to benefit from that activity.
But to the point I made earlier on about how do we move companies to action, you mentioned your membership a moment ago. The fact is that a majority of your membership haven't signed on to this particular document. And even then, your membership, even if they did, they represent 200 companies, even though they are massive, 200 massive companies. We're looking at transformation at a global scale here. What can we do that will move not just your membership, but everybody else that looks to your membership, will move them to effect the mindset change that you're advocating, to examine the capitalist model in the way you're advocating, and to change their priorities in the way you're advocating? So
just a quick pushback on the question about the number of companies involved. It's a little bit unfair. So the way that we work is we bring a group of companies together around a problem, and we do the work for all of them. So whilst we had 38 project members, 42 of are the leaders of these enormous companies who represented the 38 plus our executive committee members who weren't part of the project, sort of signed off on the leadership statement at the beginning. It is a piece of work that's been done for all of our membership, and by definition for the business world as a whole. That's one thing to say. Second,
okay, I mean, apologies if I misrepresented the situation, but you get my point.
But I think, yeah, I get your point. Secondly, it's really important to say that WBCSD, whilst it may have been on its own 10 years ago, is by no means on its own today. There is a huge ecosystem of activity going on around the world, trying to work with companies, governments, civil society to make the boat turn around. That having been said, the the work that WBCSD does will absolutely be focused on shifting our 200 members and all of the business world that they touch over the next 10 years, focusing on the different aspects of this framework, of the pathways, the mindset shifts that are required, the way in which we translate action within a company into impact in the real world through things such as policy, investment, innovation, working with our members to make sure that they spread this the guidance that Vision 2050 offers throughout their supply chains, their value chains, and so on and so forth. And actually, one of the ways in which we're advocating that companies can do the most is to start thinking about these challenges, not just in terms of what it is that they can do within their four walls, but in terms of what they need to bring to the public debate with policymakers, with citizens, with investors, in order to demonstrate their commitment to these kinds of changes, and therefore what they need from other stakeholder groups as well. So if you take capitalism, for instance, it's no good to just have a couple of actions that a handful of leading businesses try to force through. They have to have an aligned position that they're taking to policymakers all around the world to say, okay, well, if we do this, then we need you to do X, Y, and Z in order to support us. And that's really what I think the focus of one of the things that Vision 2050 will help companies with, is to think about their own actions and also the actions that are required from others, so that they can come into any situation where they're striving for change, both committed to the leadership they can offer, but humble enough to understand where they need help.
One of the points you just made concerned the issue of making declarations and commitments, and we've seen a rash in the past 6 months of companies coming out and declaring something around 2050, declaring a timeline in the future by which they will have achieved something. A lot of it is very vague, and a lot of it is questionable, to put it mildly. I want to quote to you something that Peter Backer, the head of the organization, WBCSD, said in an interview recently, which I think is relevant to this point. And he said, you cannot have a strategy that is sustainable and then be part of associations or other gatherings that advocate completely opposite positions, which is a really interesting and insightful comment, I think, because we do have a number of organizations that will say one thing and do another. Some of it will be greenwashing, some of it will be pure cynicism and hypocrisy. What can WBCSD do? What does your report do to address the reality of greenwashing and try and push companies away from that state of mind?
So it's a very good question, and this is a long-standing problem of companies making bold, appeasing statements while simultaneously advocating for the exact opposite behind closed doors through associations or otherwise. WBCSD has for some time, what's the word I'm looking for? Explicitly requested that its members refrain from such activities. We had membership conditions that came out, I think 5 or 6 years ago, I can't remember the exact date, that explicitly stated that corporate advocacy should be in line with the mission of the WBCSD. And we've recently updated our membership conditions, and that remains a core part of what we request our companies to do.
I noticed that recently you've updated that.
Yeah.
Is this an ongoing process? Is there a strategic mapping process as to what the membership criteria are going to be going forward?
Well, I mean, I think this sort of somehow answers your first question, which is what is it that WBCSD can do? So obviously we're not a national regulator. We have no power beyond our interactions with our own members. So so what we can do is we can set the playing field around what it is we believe that corporate corporate behavior needs to be if it's going to support transformation of the sort that we're talking about. And so yes, I'm not sure that they've already got a new set of membership criteria in mind that are even more ambitious than the ones that we've just updated. But the criteria aren't simply set. We go through a process of consultation with our executive committee, which are the companies who sort of steer WBCSD, with the full membership through our interactions with them to effectively, a rising tide lifts all ships is the mantra by which we operate. So they're absolutely as ambitious as we can make them, and they're certainly not. I doubt that every member agrees with each one of them. I'm sure some of those membership criteria are quite problematic for members, but the idea is to actually have a foundation on which we can have discussions with them about the kinds of progress that are required.
Okay. Julian, I mean, it's a very detailed and rich report. We've only skimmed the surface of it, and there's an awful lot of much more useful information that we really don't have time to get into. Let me end this particular conversation by sort of going back to the point we started with, which is, the concept of actually making a difference. And you began the process of rewriting the report by saying, okay, why is it that 10 years on, very little has changed? Obviously, if that happens again in the next 10 years, then we really are in serious trouble. So do you think, give me a reason to be hopeful that this time the WBCSD and his report and his membership will yield the kind of transformation that you're talking about in this report?
Yeah, so, let me start by saying we are already in serious trouble. Let me start with the downer. We really are already in very serious trouble. But I'm optimistic as well. I'm optimistic because, firstly, never before has there been, or never in recent times, has there been such a moment of reflection across global societies where both governments and companies are in a position to really think about how we get things going again in a way that is fundamentally different to how it was after the financial crisis of 2008-9. Secondly, the conversation is it's much more mature. There aren't that many companies who are not being touched by these challenges, who don't understand that environmental challenges such as biodiversity loss or climate change will affect their bottom line, that don't understand that inequality or social unrest aren't negative influences on their success. And so I'm confident that we've got the ability to have a different conversation with companies over the next 10 years, that companies are looking at not just what they can do in order to reduce emissions, for instance, but also looking at the mindsets that are required, the way in which they exist within society, the model of profit and success that they adopt. And all of these different things are coming together at this moment in a way that I think really allows us to seize the opportunities that we see coming down the line.
I don't want to end our conversation on a downer, but I can't help but think of Warren Buffett's comments just a few days ago. Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger saying how they would be very happy to continue investing in Chevron above many other companies because they don't think the climate issue is an emergency for them. So I hope at some point Peter Backer can get in front of them and get them involved in the WBCSD agenda as well. But we're going to have to leave it there, Julian. Thanks very much indeed for talking to me, and the best of luck. I hope that 10 years from now we won't be having this conversation.
So do I. I'll just say that two little final comments from my side. Buffett may have said that, but his longtime partner, Bill Gates, is absolutely clear on the fact that we have to transform everything. So he doesn't agree with Warren at all. And secondly, just remember, we didn't stop using horses because we ran out of them. So I'm quite sure that change is coming to the Chevrons and the Exxons of this world, and I very much hope that they embrace that change and devote the the power and innovative capacity that they have to the kind of world that we need to create.
Me too. Julian, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.